In 1931, the passenger ferry Starlight Serenade vanished with 88 souls aboard during a routine crossing from Port Blossom, Oregon. 75 years later, a sonar survey for a new harbor bridge would reveal a truth far more sinister than a simple maritime tragedy. The official story of a violent storm had been a carefully constructed lie, and the ship was not lost to the sea. It was deliberately hidden within it, waiting for its silent story to finally be told. The Port Blossom of 1931 was a town carved from timber and sustained by the sea. The Great Depression had tightened its grip, yet the rhythmic departure and arrival of the ferry offered a comforting pulse of normalcy. It was the artery connecting the small coastal community to the wider world, a lifeline for commerce, mail, and the families who depended on its reliability. The scent of salt, damp wood, and diesel fuel was the town's very breath, a constant reminder of its reliance on the cold Pacific. At the heart of this daily rhythm was the Starlight Serenade. She was more than a vessel. She was a point of civic pride and the flagship of the independent Port Blossom Ferry Company. Her white and blue paint was always fresh, her brass fixtures polished to a gleam. To the people of the town, she was a symbol of resilience in hard times, a testament to a local family-owned business holding its own against the encroaching influence of larger, more ruthless shipping magnates. Her master was Captain Elias Thorne, a man as dependable as the tides. A mariner of impeccable reputation, Thorne was known for his meticulous nature and unwavering commitment to safety. He knew the coastal waters not from charts alone, but from a lifetime of experience. The idea that he would ever take an unnecessary risk was unthinkable to those who served under him or entrusted their lives to his command. His record was spotless, his judgment respected throughout the maritime community. On the evening of November 12, 1931, the conditions were exceptionally placid. The water of the harbor was a sheet of dark, undisturbed glass reflecting a sliver of a crescent moon. There was no hint of an impending squall, no ominous change in atmospheric pressure. The air was cool and still as passengers boarded for the familiar nighttime crossing, merchants returning from a day of trade, families visiting relatives, and laborers heading home filled the ferry's decks with the low hum of conversation. The departure was punctual, as always. The deep thrum of the Starlight Serenade's engines echoed across the water as it pulled away from the brightly lit docks. On the bridge, Captain Thorne oversaw the maneuver with his customary focus. The vessel was running perfectly, its systems checked and double-checked before leaving port. Everything about the night pointed to a routine, uneventful journey, one of thousands the ferry had completed without incident over the years. This normalcy made what came next all the more incomprehensible. Hours before the ferry was scheduled to arrive at its destination, Captain Thorne's voice crackled over the radio for the last time. It was a standard, all-clear transmission, a brief report to the harbor master, confirming smooth sailing and clear skies. He noted the calm seas and excellent visibility, a final recorded testament that would stand in stark contradiction to the official narrative that was soon to be written. This transmission would become a ghost, haunting the edges of the accepted story for decades. As dawn approached, a quiet unease settled over the destination port. The Starlight Serenade was late. At first, the delay was dismissed as a minor mechanical issue or a miscalculation of tides. But as minutes stretched into an hour, and then two, concern curdled into genuine fear. The waiting crowd on the dock grew, their faces etched with anxiety as they stared out at an empty horizon. The ferry, a beacon of reliability, had simply failed to appear. The news spread through Port Blossom like a cold sea fog. The Port Blossom Ferry Company's office was flooded with frantic calls. The harbor master had no new information to offer. By mid-morning, the grim reality had set in. The Starlight Serenade was missing. The absence of any distress call was particularly chilling. A vessel of its size, with 88 souls aboard, did not simply vanish from calm waters without a single cry for help. The silence was the most terrifying part. A search was hastily organized, but its leadership raised eyebrows even in the midst of the crisis. The operation was largely funded and directed by Silas Vance, a powerful shipping magnate and a fierce business rival of the Thorne family. Vance publicly presented his involvement as a magnanimous gesture of community solidarity, a powerful man lending his resources in a time of need. Yet his rivalry with the Port Blossom Ferry Company was well known and deeply acrimonious. Under Vance's direction, the search efforts focused exclusively on the deep, open waters miles offshore. His ships and spotter planes scoured a vast predetermined search grid far from the coastline and the harbor's intricate channels. When some questioned this strategy, suggesting the ferry might have encountered trouble closer to shore, their concerns were dismissed by Vance's experienced captains as amateur speculation. The search, they insisted, was being conducted in the only logical place a ship could be lost. After 3 grueling days, with hope dwindling and resources strained, Silas Vance publicly called off the search. He declared that his teams had done everything humanly possible. No wreckage, no oil slicks, and no bodies had been found. The vast, empty expanse of the Pacific, he announced with somber finality, had swallowed the Starlight Serenade whole, leaving no trace of its passage or its violent end. The sea had claimed its victims, and it was time for the community to begin mourning. With the search concluded, an official narrative was swiftly cemented, heavily influenced by Vance's public statements. A freak rogue wave, born from a sudden unforecasted squall, was blamed for the disaster. The story was that the storm had appeared and vanished with supernatural speed, catching even the most experienced mariner by surprise. It was a tragic, unavoidable act of God, a brutal reminder of nature's unpredictable power over the affairs of men, a story that offered a simple, if painful, explanation. To complete the narrative, blame was posthumously laid upon Captain Elias Thorne. It was suggested that his final all-clear message was a sign of recklessness, that he had failed to heed subtle warnings of the impending storm in a foolish attempt to maintain his schedule. Without a body, a wreck, or a single survivor to contradict this version of events, the captain's sterling reputation was tarnished. He was recast as the flawed hero of a tragedy he had inadvertently caused. The community of Port Blossom was left with a gaping wound. 88 of its own were gone, their bodies consigned to an unmarked grave at the bottom of the ocean. The Port Blossom Ferry Company, having lost its flagship vessel and its respected captain, collapsed within months. The loss was not just financial, but spiritual, as the town's symbol of independence and resilience had been extinguished in a single, inexplicable night. The void was quickly filled by Vance Shipping. In the wake of the tragedy, Silas Vance's company absorbed the defunct ferry routes, securing the lucrative government contracts the Thornes had fought so hard to win. His business empire flourished, built upon the foundation of his rival's ruin. He funded a modest stone memorial near the docks, its bronze plaque listing the names of the 88 victims of the Great November Squall, forever enshrining the official, fabricated account of the disaster into the town's physical landscape. For the Thorne family, the grief was compounded by the injustice. They never believed the official story. They knew Elias Thorne was not a reckless man, and they knew the weather that night had been clear. His great-grandson, Eris, would be born into this legacy of doubt, a family shadow that stretched across generations. The official verdict was a lie they were forced to live with, a public record that dishonored the man they knew and loved. Decades passed. The story of the Starlight Serenade transitioned from a raw, painful memory into a piece of local folklore. It became a ghost story told to frightened children, a cautionary tale about the unforgiving nature of the sea. The Ferry and its 88 souls became a permanent part of the region's mythology, a tragedy that defined an era for Port Blossom. The truth, however, remained submerged, preserved in the cold, dark water. The town evolved, its waterfront modernizing, its economy shifting. The Vance shipping empire became a philanthropic dynasty, its origins in the 1931 tragedy all but forgotten by the public. The memorial was a place for quiet reflection, its story of a storm and a tragic accident accepted as historical fact. The open wound had scarred over, but beneath the surface, the unresolved questions lingered, waiting for a catalyst to bring them back into the light. The official explanation was clean, simple, and left no room for argument. An act of God. A captain's error, a community's shared loss. It was a narrative that served the interests of the powerful, providing a resolution that discouraged further inquiry. It allowed a town to move on and a business empire to rise without the inconvenient stain of a deeper, more complex truth. It was a perfectly constructed story designed to bury the facts. But the ocean does not erase history, it merely holds it in suspension. The accepted version of events, solid as it seemed, was built on a foundation of lies and omissions. The hastily concluded search, the focus on the wrong location, and the convenient smearing of a good man's name were all pieces of a much larger, more deliberate puzzle. The narrative was not an explanation, it was a cover-up. For 75 years, the town of Port Blossom believed it knew what happened on that calm November night. They mourned the victims of a storm that never was, and whispered the name of a captain who was wrongly blamed. The ferry became a legend, a fixed point in the town's history, its final resting place a mystery that was considered permanently unsolvable. The families of the lost lived with a sense of profound incompletion. Without a body to bury or a wreck to mark, their grief remained abstract, a constant, low-grade ache. They were haunted not just by the loss, but by the nagging feeling that the story they were told was not the whole story. This feeling was a quiet inheritance passed down through the generations. The true account of the Starlight Serenade's final hours rested silently in the dark, less than a mile from where it had last departed. It was not a tomb scattered across the ocean floor by the fury of a storm, but a crime scene, perfectly preserved and deliberately concealed. The official story was designed to keep it hidden forever. But what they didn't know was that the truth was not lost, only waiting. In the year 2006, Port Blossom was a town that had made peace with its ghosts. The Vance Corporation, now a global logistics behemoth, had transformed the once modest port into a bustling hub of commerce. Its philanthropic, arm-funded schools, hospitals, and parks, its name etched onto every major civic institution. The tragedy of the Starlight Serenade was a distant, somber chapter in the town's official history, a story of nature's fury and a community's resilience. The past, it seemed, was settled, its truths carved into the stone of the waterfront memorial. Progress demanded expansion. A new state-of-the-art suspension bridge was slated to span the harbor entrance, a project designed to accommodate the massive container ships that were the lifeblood of the modern Vance Empire. The preliminary work was routine: geotechnical surveys, seafloor mapping, and environmental impact assessments. A small, unassuming vessel named the Pathfinder was tasked with creating a high-resolution sonar map of the channel floor, a standard procedure to identify any geological hazards or forgotten debris before construction could begin on the bridge's massive support caissons. For days, the work was monotonous. The sonar array painted a familiar picture of silt, rock, and the occasional piece of modern refuse. But on a Tuesday afternoon, a technician monitoring the feed noticed an anomaly. It was a shape too large, too symmetrical, to be a natural formation. It rested in a deep, narrow trench just inside the harbor, an area long known to local mariners as the Silent Channel, a treacherous shortcut avoided by all but the most reckless captains. It was a place no large vessel had any reason to be. A second pass with the side-scan sonar removed all doubt. It was a ship, a passenger ferry from a bygone era, its silhouette unmistakable against the muddy bottom. It was resting perfectly upright, as if carefully placed there. The dimensions, cross-referenced with archived maritime records, produced a stunning match. The anomaly was not just any ship. It was the Starlight Serenade, found not in the vast, deep Pacific where the search had focused, but less than a mile from the docks it had departed 75 years prior. The news broke like a thunderclap, sending a shockwave of disbelief through Port Blossom and beyond. The discovery of the legendary ghost ship was a media sensation. News crews descended on the town, their cameras trained on the unassuming survey vessel that had accidentally rewritten history. The official story of the Great November Squall and the rogue wave was repeated on every broadcast, but now it was framed not as a fact, but as a question. How could a ship lost to a violent storm in the open ocean be resting peacefully inside the harbor? For Dr. Eris Thorne, a maritime historian at the University of Oregon, the news was more than a professional curiosity. It was a personal reckoning. At 42, he had dedicated his life to studying the maritime history of the Pacific Northwest, a career path driven by a single, unresolved family wound, the legacy of his great-grandfather, Captain Elias Thorne. Eris had never accepted the official narrative that painted the man he knew from family stories as reckless. The discovery of the ferry was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. He arrived in Port Blossom within 24 hours, the town of his ancestors feeling both familiar and alien. The Vance name was everywhere, on the library, the Performing Arts Center, the very Port Authority building where he was scheduled to meet with the National Transportation Safety Board. He felt the immense weight of the family dynasty that had risen from the ashes of his own family's ruin. He was not just a historian here. He was the last voice of the accused, stepping into the heart of a 75-year-old crime scene. The initial investigation was conducted remotely. A deep-sea ROV, a robotic submersible equipped with high-definition cameras and manipulator arms, was deployed from the Pathfinder. The first images it sent back were breathtaking and deeply unsettling. The Starlight Serenade was hauntingly preserved in the cold, anoxic water. Its wooden benches were still intact, its paint blistered but visible. There was no evidence of a catastrophic impact or the violent shredding one would expect from a rogue wave. The ship was whole. The ROV's lights glided over the vessel's nameplate, the brass letters Starlight Serenade, tarnished but legible. It drifted past the pilot-house windows, revealing a dark, silent interior where Captain Thorne had last stood. The eerie state of preservation was the first piece of hard evidence that directly contradicted the official story. A storm violent enough to sink a ship of this size in minutes would have torn it to pieces, scattering wreckage across miles of ocean floor. This was not a shipwreck. It was a tomb. Eris watched the live feed in a small crowded room at the Port Authority, his jaw tight. He felt a cold sense of vindication wash over him. For generations, his family had been forced to carry the quiet shame of Captain Thorne's alleged failure, but the silent vessel on the screen was already telling a different story. It spoke not of a struggle against nature, but of a deliberate, methodical sinking. The official narrative was not just wrong, it was a fabrication. The NTSB investigators, initially cautious, grew more resolute with every new piece of data. They directed the ROV to inspect the ship's key mechanical components. The footage of the main deck revealed something that made everyone in the room fall silent. The lifeboat davits were empty, but the lifeboats themselves were nowhere to be found near the wreck. They hadn't been torn away by waves. They had been properly launched, suggesting an orderly, controlled evacuation for at least some of the crew. A team of specialized saturation divers was called in for a direct inspection, a dangerous but necessary step. Their report from the first dive was the turning point. They confirmed that the Ferry's sea cocks, the large valves designed to let seawater in for ballast or maintenance, had been opened from inside the engine room. They were not damaged or forced, they were simply unlocked and turned, a deliberate act of scuttling that would have flooded the lower compartments steadily and irreversibly. This discovery transformed the investigation. An accident was now officially off the table. The conversation shifted from maritime tragedy to intentional sabotage. The question was no longer how the ship sank, but who sank it. The 88 souls aboard were no longer victims of a natural disaster. They were the victims of a crime, a mass murder that had been successfully concealed for 3/4 of a century. The focus now turned to the motive. Aris provided the historical context the investigators lacked. He laid out the bitter rivalry between the Port Blossom Ferry Company and Vance Shipping in 1931. He presented evidence of the lucrative government contract his great-grandfather's company had secured just weeks before the disappearance, a contract that would have financially crippled Silas Vance. When the Starlight Serenade vanished, the contract defaulted, and Vance Shipping was the sole beneficiary, securing its monopoly on the harbor. The motive was clear, but they still needed irrefutable proof of the act itself. The dive team was sent down again, this time with a specific objective: to conduct a full structural survey of the hull. They were looking for any anomaly, any sign of damage that the ROV might have missed in the deep gloom and thick silt that had accumulated around the vessel's base over the decades. Working methodically along the port side, just below the waterline, one of the divers found it. It was not a gash or a crack from hitting a rock. It was a crude circular hole about 2 feet in diameter, the steel plates around it peeled outward like a grotesque metal flower. The edges were blackened and warped, showing the telltale signs of a high-temperature event. It was damage inconsistent with any form of collision or structural failure. Forensic analysis of the metal fragments brought back to the surface confirmed the investigators' darkest suspicions. The metallurgical report was unequivocal. The hole was the result of a small, deliberately placed explosive charge. It was a scuttling charge designed to breach the hull and hasten the sinking process, ensuring the vessel would go down quickly and quietly in the deep channel, far from the main shipping lanes where it might be found. This was the final damning piece of evidence. The Starlight Serenade had not been lost in a storm. It had been hijacked, steered into the silent channel, systematically flooded by its own crew or captors, and then blown open to ensure it sank without a trace. The official story was not just a mistake. It was a meticulously constructed lie, designed to cover up a carefully orchestrated act of corporate terrorism. The case of the Starlight Serenade was officially reopened, reclassified from a maritime accident to an active homicide investigation involving 88 victims. The NTSB handed its findings over to the State Attorney General. The news ignited a firestorm, shaking the foundations of Port Blossom and the Vance Corporation. The town's founding myth had been shattered, replaced by a chilling conspiracy. For Aris Thorne, the moment was bittersweet. His great-grandfather's name was on the path to being cleared, but the scale of the crime was staggering. This was not about one man's reputation anymore. It was about 88 silenced voices and a fortune built upon a massacre. He knew that finding the ship was only the first step. The real challenge would be to prove who gave the order. The discovery had answered the 75-year-old question of what happened to the ferry, but in doing so, it had opened up a far more dangerous one. Who was responsible? And how had they managed to bury the truth for so long? The ship had been found, but its secrets were still locked away inside its silent, watery grave. The quiet, melancholic mystery of a lost ship had transformed overnight into a sprawling investigation of a cold-blooded murder. The carefully crafted narrative that had held for decades had crumbled to dust, exposing the rotten foundations beneath. The town of Port Blossom was forced to confront a history it never knew it had, a legacy of violence hidden in plain sight. The initial shock of the discovery began to fade, replaced by a tense, urgent need for answers. The focus of the investigation shifted from the wreck itself to the archives, to the old business dealings, and to the powerful family whose empire was now inextricably linked to the crime. The physical evidence was undeniable, but the human story of that night remained a ghost. The Vance Corporation, through its current CEO, Julian Vance, issued a public statement expressing shock and pledging full cooperation with the investigation. They positioned themselves as fellow seekers of the truth, eager to honor the victims by uncovering the full story. But to Eris, their words rang hollow, a modern echo of the same public relations strategy Silas Vance had used 75 years ago. The NTSB declared the wreck a protected site, a submerged crime scene. Further investigation would require a more delicate and targeted approach. They needed to get inside, specifically into the sealed captain's quarters and the ship's safe, where logs or records might have survived. The answers were no longer in the water, but inside the ship itself. The discovery had provided the how and the where. Now, Eris and the investigators had to unravel the who and the why. They were staring at a conspiracy that had been perfectly executed, its secret kept for the better part of a century. A crime of this magnitude required planning, resources, and a ruthless will to silence anyone who stood in the way. The entire community held its breath. The names on the memorial no longer represented victims of a tragic accident, but casualties of a hidden war. Every aspect of the town's history was now cast in a sinister new light. The Vance legacy, once a source of civic pride, was now a symbol of profound and unsettling doubt. The truth had been submerged, but it had not been erased. It was preserved, waiting for the right technology and the right person to bring it to the surface. Eris Thorne now stood at the precipice of that truth, knowing that the journey to uncover it would be fraught with resistance from those who had the most to lose. The ship was a time capsule, a perfectly preserved moment of violence and betrayal. It held the key not only to clearing a good man's name, but to exposing a foundational crime that had shaped the destiny of an entire region. The investigators had the body of the crime. Now they had to find its soul. The initial phase of the investigation was complete. The evidence collected from the exterior of the Starlight Serenade had irrevocably proven that the ship was deliberately sunk. The official narrative was dead, and in its place stood the cold, hard reality of a mass murder. But this discovery was merely the first piece of a macabre puzzle that nobody was prepared to assemble. The new investigation began not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of computer fans in a temporary command center at the Port Blossom Port Authority. With the exterior analysis complete, the case had been officially handed over from the NTSB to a joint task force led by the Oregon State Attorney General's office. Dr. Eris Thorne was granted a unique role as a historical consultant, his academic expertise now a critical component of a live homicide investigation. His partner in this deep dive into the past was Kira Diaz, a sharp, no-nonsense senior investigator who saw the 75-year-old case not as a historical curiosity, but as a cold file that had just been thawed by a sonar pulse. Her objective was simple: build a case that could, at the very least, hold up in the court of public opinion and expose the truth, even if the perpetrators were long dead. Their first official act was met with immediate and powerful resistance. Julian Vance, the silver-haired patriarch of the Vance Corporation and grandson of Silas, held a press conference on the steps of the Vance Philanthropic Foundation building. With practiced solemnity, he called for the Starlight Serenade. to be immediately designated a national marine sanctuary and protected grave site. He argued that to disturb the vessel further would be a desecration, a violation of the final resting place of 88 souls. "Let them rest in peace," he urged, his voice resonating with paternalistic authority. "Their families have suffered enough. Our goal now should be to honor their memory, not to pick at old wounds with invasive and unnecessary procedures." It was a masterful public relations move, framing his opposition as an act of profound respect. Eris watched the broadcast from the command center, a cold fury rising in his chest. He saw the strategy for what it was, a sophisticated attempt to bury the evidence for a second time, this time under the guise of piety and legal protection. To Diaz, he pointed out the chilling parallel. In 1931, Silas Vance controlled the search, ensuring nothing was found. Now in 2006, Julian Vance is trying to control the wreck, ensuring nothing more is found. "It's the same playbook, just 75 years later," Diaz agreed, her expression hardening. The Vance family wasn't just cooperating, they were actively obstructing, and their first move confirmed that they had something to hide. The battle for the truth would be fought not just in the archives, but in the courtrooms and the media. The task force's first priority was to dismantle the official narrative piece by piece, using modern technology to disprove the foundational lies. They began with the weather. While the 1931 inquiry had relied on anecdotal accounts and the logbooks of a few nearby ships, Diaz's team accessed digitized National Meteorological Archives. They compiled a comprehensive atmospheric pressure and wind speed model for the entire Pacific Northwest on the night of November 12, 1931. The resulting data was unequivocal and visually stark. A high-pressure system dominated the coast, creating conditions of exceptional calm. The sudden, violent squall was a complete fabrication. There was no act of God, only the act of men simultaneously. Eris delved into the Port Blossom County archives, a place that smelled of decaying paper and forgotten secrets. He was looking for the motive, the financial bedrock of the crime. He found it in a dusty, leather-bound ledger containing the minutes of the Harbor Commission meetings from 1931. The records detailed the awarding of a new exclusive 20-year federal contract to manage all freight and mail transport for the region. The contract was a death sentence for any company that didn't win it. The final vote, dated just 2 weeks before the ferry's disappearance, showed a unanimous decision in favor of the Port Blossom Ferry Company. Silas Vance's bid had been rejected. The financial implications were staggering, and Eris laid them out for Diaz on a whiteboard. With the contract, the Thorne family's company was poised to become the dominant maritime power on the coast. Without it, Vance Shipping, which was heavily over-leveraged, faced certain bankruptcy within 6 months. The disappearance of the Starlight Serenade did more than just eliminate a rival. It triggered a default clause in the federal contract. With the Port Blossom Ferry Company unable to fulfill its duties, the contract was immediately reassigned to the runner-up, Vance Shipping. The foundation of the Vance empire wasn't built on business acumen. It was built on the timely and convenient elimination of its sole competitor. The investigation then turned to the original search effort. Using the sonar data from the bridge project, the team created a high-resolution 3D map of the harbor and its approaches. On this map, they overlaid the search grids from 1931, meticulously transcribed from Silas Vance's own company records, which he had proudly donated to the Historical Society years later. The visual was damning. The search patterns showed Vance's ships conducting a thorough, exhaustive sweep of the deep Pacific miles offshore. They had meticulously searched a vast area where the ferry was not. The one place they conspicuously avoided was the network of deep channels inside the harbor itself, including the Silent Channel, where the ship had been waiting for 75 years. The question became a mantra in the command center. Why would an experienced mariner like Silas Vance, a man who knew these waters intimately, search everywhere except his own backyard? The answer was chillingly obvious. He wasn't searching for the ship, he was performing the acte of searching, creating a public spectacle of civic duty while ensuring the ship remained precisely where his men had left it. He had directed the gaze of the entire community out to the empty sea, while the evidence of his crime rested silently less than a mile from where he stood on the docks, feigning grief and offering condolences to the families of the victims he had created. Julian Vance's response to these emerging facts was a carefully orchestrated campaign of doubt. Through his lawyers and public relations team, he dismissed the financial records as simplistic interpretations of complex market forces and the weather data as unreliable historical modeling. He contended that his grandfather's search efforts were based on the best available information at the time, painting any criticism as an unfair attack on a dead man's honor using the biased lens of modern hindsight. He was building a firewall of plausible deniability around his family's legacy. But with each new piece of evidence, the cracks in that wall began to show. The investigation needed to connect the act of sabotage directly to Vance. Aris and Diaz turned their attention to the passenger manifest of the Starlight Serenade's final voyage. It listed 79 passengers and 9 crew members. Working with federal agencies, Diaz began running the passenger names through every database available, a task impossible in 1931. Most checked out, their identities confirmed through descendants or census records. But a block of 5 men proved to be ghosts. They had purchased one-way tickets with cash just minutes before departure. Their names yielded no birth certificates, no work histories, no trace of existence before or after that night. Aris cross-referenced the manifest with Vance Shipping's employee records from that era. He found no direct matches, but he did find a pattern. In the years leading up to 1931, Silas Vance was embroiled in brutal anti-union conflicts at the docks. His company employed a security division, a euphemism for a crew of violent strikebreakers known for their ruthless efficiency. The official records of these men were sparse, their employment often off the books, but their descriptions, gleaned from old police reports of dockside brawls, matched anecdotal accounts of the unidentified men who boarded the ferry, large, imposing figures who kept to themselves. The circumstantial chain was becoming a cable, a motive of corporate survival, the means of sabotage, a deliberately misdirected search, and a team of phantom passengers with links to Vance's violent enforcement arm. The case was solidifying in the past, but the key to irrefutable proof lay in the present, inside the wreck itself. The task force formally petitioned the court to allow a limited, targeted interior exploration of the Starlight Serenade, specifically focusing on the captain's quarters and the purser's office, where a ship's safe would be located. They argued that the vessel was not a gravesite, but a crime scene containing critical evidence in a mass homicide. Julian Vance's legal team immediately filed an emergency injunction to block the petition, escalating the conflict. Their argument was emotional and powerful, citing maritime law and the sanctity of the dead. They produced statements from a handful of victims' descendants, unaware of the full picture, who supported their call to leave the ship undisturbed. For a week, the fate of the investigation hung in the balance, debated by lawyers in a sterile courtroom. The public was divided, torn between a desire for truth and a deep-seated respect for the dead. The Vance narrative, a tale of tragedy and honor, was fighting its last stand against Aris Thorne's narrative of conspiracy and murder. The judge, a stern woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation, a fact she made clear on the first day, listened to both sides intently. The state argued that the 88 victims deserved justice and that justice required evidence. Vance's lawyers argued that the victims deserved peace and that peace required non-disturbance. After 2 days of deliberation, Judge Vance delivered her ruling. She acknowledged the immense sensitivity of the site, but concluded that the pursuit of justice for 88 potential homicide victims constitutes a compelling public interest that outweighs the admittedly significant concerns for the site's preservation as a memorial. The injunction was denied. The dive was approved. The victory was monumental, but the pressure intensified. The dive team, a specialized unit contracted by the state, began to plan the operation with military precision. They would use a small, agile ROV to first survey the interior corridors, assessing structural integrity. Their target was the captain's cabin on the upper deck. The plan was to use robotic arms to breach the cabin door, which was likely sealed shut by 75 years of pressure and corrosion. It was a delicate, high-stakes procedure. One wrong move could cause a section of the weakened superstructure to collapse, destroying the very evidence they were seeking. Aris felt a profound weight settle on him as he watched the preparations. He had brought the investigation this far, peeling back the layers of a decades-old lie. He had proven there was no storm, exposed the fraudulent search, and established a powerful motive. He had followed the cold, logical trail of evidence. But he knew that the final, irrefutable proof, the smoking gun, had to come from the ship itself. It needed to be a voice from the past, an artifact that could speak for the dead and name their killer. He thought of his great-grandfather, Elias, alone on the bridge in his final moments. What had he seen? What had he done? The day of the dive arrived, gray and overcast, the sky matching the color of the harbor water. In the command center, a massive screen showed a live feed from the primary ROV, its powerful lights cutting a cone of white through the murky green depths. The mood was electric with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Julian Vance had lost the legal battle, but he had not gone silent. In a final defiant statement, he warned that whatever the state found inside the desecrated vessel would be tainted, the product of a reckless and biased investigation driven by one man's family vendetta. He was preparing his defense for a truth he clearly already knew. The ROV, named Orpheus by its crew, moved with eerie grace through the water. It approached the ferry's superstructure, its camera gliding past the ghostly outlines of deck railings and windows. It navigated to the port side of the officer's deck and hovered before a simple wooden door with a tarnished brass plaque. Captain E. Thorne. This was the focal point of a 75-year-old mystery, the silent chamber that held the final moments of the ship's command. The tension in the command center was a physical presence. No one spoke, no one moved. All eyes were fixed on the screen, waiting. The ROV's manipulator arms extended, tools whirring softly as they engaged the doorframe. The wood was soft, pulpy from its long immersion. The process was painstakingly slow, the operators carefully cutting around the lock mechanism, rather than forcing it, trying to preserve the cabin's interior from the violent rush of displaced water and silt. Minutes stretched into an hour. Aris found himself holding his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything hinged on what was or was not behind that door. The entire edifice of lies built by Silas Vance was about to face its final test. Finally, with a gentle push, a section of the door swung inward into the blackness of the cabin. A cloud of fine, disturbed silt billowed out, momentarily obscuring the camera's view. The ROV operator held the submersible steady, waiting for the particulate to settle. As the view slowly cleared, the ROV's lights pushed into the captain's cabin for the first time since 1931. The room was a scene of suspended chaos, objects floating in the gentle current, or half buried in a thick layer of silt on the floor. It was a time capsule sealed by murder. The first identifiable object to come into view was a small, overturned wooden desk. Pinned beneath one of its legs and miraculously preserved by the lack of oxygen and the constant cold was a heavy, leather-bound book. Its cover was warped, but it was unmistakably a ship's logbook. It was Captain Thorne's final record, a potential first-hand account of the hijacking and sinking. This was the prize, the object that could connect every circumstantial thread. The team knew with a sudden, shocking certainty that they were on the verge of hearing a voice that had been silenced for 3/4 of a century. The task of retrieving the logbook would be another immense challenge, requiring a level of dexterity at the edge of the ROV's capabilities. But its very presence was a confirmation. Aris felt a wave of vindication so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. His great-grandfather had not been reckless. He had been a victim, a witness. He had fought back in the only way he could. He had written it down. The truth had been there all along, waiting in the dark, silent cabin for someone to come and find it. Diaz gave the order to the ROV team to prepare for the delicate extraction. The atmosphere in the room shifted from one of tense anticipation to one of focused, determined purpose. They had found the potential key to the entire conspiracy, the proof trophy that could finally bring the case to its definitive conclusion. The Vance dynasty had been built upon a carefully constructed lie that a violent storm had swallowed the Starlight Serenade. But the truth was far more terrifying. The ship had been swallowed by greed. The team prepared for the next phase, the careful retrieval of the captain's log. They were about to raise a truth from the deep that had been deliberately submerged, a story of mutiny and murder written in its final, desperate moments. What they didn't know was that the words written on those preserved pages were more explicit, more damning, and more personally incriminating to Silas Vance than any of them could possibly have imagined. The silent ship was finally ready to speak. The recovery of Captain Thorne's logbook was an operation of surgical precision, broadcast live to a captivated world. The ROV Orpheus, with its delicate manipulator claws, cradled the leather-bound volume as if it were a sacred artifact. As it broke the surface, hoisted onto the deck of the recovery vessel, a collective gasp seemed to ripple through Port Blossom. This was not merely a piece of wreckage, it was a voice from the deep, a potential testament that had been silenced for 75 years. Aris Thorne watched from the command center, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. The entire weight of his family's history of 88 lost souls was contained within that waterlogged book. He felt not triumph, but a profound and terrifying sense of responsibility for the words it held. In a climate-controlled laboratory at the Oregon Historical Society, the painstaking process of preservation began. Under the watchful eyes of Aris, investigator Kira Diaz, and a team of forensic archivists, the logbook was carefully opened. The pages, stiff and fragile, were separated with painstaking care. The ink had long since vanished, but the graphite from Elias Thorne's pencil had bonded with the paper fibers, leaving faint but legible impressions. The final entries were written in a hurried, powerful script, the deep grooves of the pencil a testament to the pressure and urgency under which they were written. The room was silent, the only sound the gentle hum of dehumidifiers, as the last words of a dead man were prepared to be read. Aris was given the honor of reading the final entries aloud, his voice steady but thick with emotion. The first sentence struck the room like a physical blow. November 12th, 10:47 p.m. We have been boarded. 5 men, claiming to be Vance's enforcers, have taken the bridge at gunpoint. The official narrative of a storm was not just disproven, it was annihilated in a single chilling statement. The log went on to detail a scene of cold, organized mutiny. Captain Thorne described how the hijackers knew the ship's layout intimately, proceeding directly to the engine room to force the chief engineer to open the seacocks. The sinking was not an accident. It was a methodical, deliberate execution of a vessel and everyone on board. The captain's words painted a vivid, horrifying picture of the ferry's final hour. He wrote of the crew's quiet, desperate resistance and the passengers' growing confusion and fear as the vessel slowed and veered from its course. The hijackers were professional, wasting no words and using the threat of violence with chilling efficiency. Thorne's account was not just a log of events, it was a profile of a corporate assassination. He described the lead hijacker relaying a message over a portable radio, confirming to an unknown party on the other end that the package is being delivered to the channel. The plan was precise, the execution flawless, and the motive, though not stated, was terrifyingly clear. The most damning entry came last, written on the final page as the Ferry listed heavily, the sounds of groaning metal and rushing water echoing through the hull. They have steered us into the silent channel. The charge has been set. There are no lifeboats for the passengers. This is a massacre. Silas Vance's orders. He said no witnesses. May God forgive him, and may God have mercy on us all. The name spoken from the grave hung in the air of the sterile lab. It was no longer a theory or a circumstantial link. It was a direct accusation from the man who had paid for Vance's ambition with his life, a final act of defiance to ensure the truth was recorded. The logbook's contents were authenticated by a dozen experts, its graphite impressions and paper composition matching the era perfectly. When the final entry was released to the public by the Attorney General's office, the carefully constructed legacy of the Vance family shattered like glass. The Vance Corporation became a symbol not of civic pride, but of a foundational crime. Protests erupted outside its headquarters. The story was no longer about a historical discovery. It was about a dynasty built on a mass grave. Julian Vance, once the untouchable patriarch of Port Blossom, became a pariah overnight, his name synonymous with the murderer whose fortune he had inherited. Cornered and facing federal indictment for obstruction and his family's historical crimes, Julian Vance agreed to a single live television interview. It was a desperate gamble to reclaim the narrative. In a stark, brightly lit studio, he faced a renowned journalist, his face a mask of weary composure. He began by attacking Eris Thorne's credibility, calling the investigation a personal vendetta, and suggesting the logbook could be an elaborate forgery designed to destroy his family. He spoke of his grandfather as a pillar of the community, a man of honor incapable of such monstrous acts. He was playing the part of the wronged descendant, defending a noble legacy from a modern-day witch hunt. Aris and Kira Diaz watched from an adjacent room, the feed displayed on a large monitor. As Julian spun his web of denial and misdirection, Diaz leaned over to Aris. "He's good," she whispered. "He's going to plant just enough doubt to muddy the waters for years." But Aris was calm. He knew the logbook was only the first part of the revelation. The state had acted on the information within it, seizing decades of private Vance family records from a secure vault. Among the ledgers and business dealings, they had found Silas Vance's private journal, a document Julian had clearly never known existed, detailing his own version of the events. At a pre-arranged signal, the journalist turned to her monitor. "Mr. Vance, we have just received a document from the Attorney General's office. It is a page from your grandfather's personal journal dated November 14th, 1931, 2 days after the sinking." The camera zoomed in on a high-resolution image of a ledger page. The handwriting was elegant, the words chillingly pragmatic. It read, "The Thorne matter is concluded. The asset has been retired to the channel as planned. Cost of acquisition was high, but the contract is now secure. The 5 contractors have been paid their bonus and sent south. Loose ends are tied." It was a confession written in the cold language of a business transaction. Julian Vance stared at the screen, his face draining of all color. The carefully maintained mask of indignation crumbled, replaced by a raw, slack-jawed shock. This was not his grandfather's public persona. This was the monster from Elias Thorne's logbook, speaking in his own hand. The journal entry was the final irrefutable link, the proof trophy that corroborated every word the captain had written. It detailed not only the murder but the cover-up, the misdirection of the search, and the payments to the phantom passengers. The lie was not just exposed, it was autopsied on live television for the world to see. The journalist's voice was quiet but relentless. "Mr. Vance, this is your grandfather's own account. It confirms the mutiny, the scuttling, and the motive. It refers to 88 human beings as a retired asset. Is this also a forgery?" For a long moment, Julian said nothing. The silence in the studio was absolute. He looked down at his hands, then up at the camera, his eyes hollow. The fight was gone. The weight of a secret kept for 3 generations had finally crushed him. "I found his papers years ago," he whispered, his voice cracking. I knew he was a monster. I wanted to build something good from it, to make up for it." His confession was the final act. It was an admission not of murder, but of a lifetime spent perpetuating the lie, enjoying the fruits of a crime so vast it had defined the entire region. He had chosen the family fortune over the truth, becoming the final accomplice in his grandfather's massacre. As law enforcement officers entered the studio, the broadcast ended, leaving the nation with the indelible image of a dynasty's complete and utter collapse. The truth, submerged for so long, had finally risen to the surface with the force of a tidal wave, washing away a century of carefully constructed deceit. The legal fallout was swift and devastating. While Julian Vance was tried for obstruction of justice and the cover-up, the Vance Corporation was dismantled under the weight of civil suits from the descendants of the 88 victims. A multi-billion-dollar restitution fund was established, a final belated payment for the lives that had been traded for a federal contract. The Vance name was stripped from every hospital wing, library, and public park, erased from the civic landscape it had once dominated. The empire built on a lie had been consumed by the truth, its foundations proven to be nothing more than blood and water. In Port Blossom, the old stone memorial to the victims of the Great November Squall was solemnly taken down. In its place, a new memorial was erected near the harbor entrance, overlooking the silent channel. It was a simple, elegant wall of black granite, bearing the 88 names under a new truthful inscription: "In memory of the victims of the Starlight Serenade, November 12, 1931. Murdered but never forgotten." The dedication ceremony was attended by thousands, including the descendants of the victims from all over the country. They finally had a place to mourn, not a tragedy, but a crime, and to honor the true story of their ancestors. At the ceremony, Captain Elias Thorne was posthumously awarded the state's highest civilian honor for his bravery and his dedication to recording the truth in his final moments. Harris Thorne accepted the medal on behalf of his great-grandfather. Standing at the podium looking out at the faces of the other families, he felt the 75-year-old burden finally lift. He spoke not of anger or revenge, but of the enduring power of memory and the moral imperative to seek the truth, no matter how long it has been buried. His family's name was not just cleared, it was now a symbol of persistence and vindication. After the crowds had dispersed, Harris stood alone before the new memorial, his fingers tracing the engraved letters of his great-grandfather's name. Kira Diaz joined him, standing quietly by his side. "You did it," she said softly. "You gave them their names back." Harris nodded, looking out toward the calm waters of the harbor. "He did it," he replied. "He wrote it down. All we had to do was listen." The sense of closure was profound, a bittersweet mixture of sorrow for the lives lost and a deep, abiding peace that justice, in its slow, grinding way, had finally been served. The Starlight Serenade itself was declared a National Historic Monument and a protected gravesite, its story now part of the official record. It would remain in the Silent Channel, a permanent underwater testament to the crime. Its purpose had changed. It was no longer a forgotten tomb shrouded in a lie, but a classroom, a memorial, and a stark reminder that history's debts always come due. The ghost story of Port Blossom had found its final chapter, not in folklore or speculation, but in the undeniable clarity of the historical record. For Aris, the journey was over. He returned to his life as a historian, but with a new sense of purpose. He had not just studied history, he had helped to correct it. The shadow that had loomed over his family for generations had vanished, replaced by the light of a difficult but necessary truth. He had honored the dead by unearthing their story, and in doing so, had given the living a chance to finally heal. The silence of the deep had been broken, and the voices of the 88 souls aboard the Starlight Serenade could finally rest in peace. The resolution brought a quiet end to the storm of revelation. The town of Port Blossom began to redefine itself, its identity no longer tied to the benevolent myth of the Vance dynasty, but to a more complex and honest history. The story became a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of greed and the incredible resilience of truth. It served as a testament to the idea that no crime, no matter how perfectly executed or deeply buried, is ever truly safe from the currents of time and the persistence of memory. The final image is of Aris, years later, standing on the deck of a new ferry crossing the harbor. He looks toward the spot where the Starlight Serenade rests, a place now marked on all the official charts. He feels a connection not just to his own past, but to all the stories that lie waiting beneath the surface. He understands that justice is not always a swift or simple thing. Sometimes it is a long, patient process of listening to the silence until the ghosts of the past are finally ready to speak their truth. The truth, much like a sunken ship, does not vanish. It simply waits in the cold, dark depths, perfectly preserved. It is immune to the stories told on the surface, indifferent to the empires built upon its absence. It holds its breath for years, for decades, for generations, waiting for a single moment of discovery to bring it rushing back into the light. And when it rises, it carries the undeniable power to wash away the most entrenched of lies, reminding us all that history is a tide that eventually, inevitably, brings every secret back to shore.